looks like they faced a bit of danger and then they moved on. Once safely through the danger, this certain person explained to him that this unusual change in the quiet face of the river was caused by a great dam which had been built by Nimrud. Footnote at the bottom. This dam is called by the Arabs either Sukr el Nimrud, Sukr el Nimrud from the tradition, or el Awai from the noise caused by the breaking of the water over the stones. Large rafts were obliged to unload before crossing it, and accidents frequently happened to those who neglected this precaution, to be careful, right? Because it could rise up and be very, very dangerous as they face, right? And it goes on about that. The Arab explained, the guy that travelled with them, the Arab explained the connection between the dam and the city built by Athur, the lieutenant of Nimrud, the vast ruins of which were then before them, and of its purpose as a causeway for the mighty hunters to cross the opposite palace, now represented by the mound of Hamum Ali. He was telling Layard, the author, of the histories and fate of the kings of the primitive race, still the favourite theme of the inhabitants of the plain of Shinar. When the last glow of twilight faded away and he fell asleep as they glided onward to Baghdad. It wasn't until 1842 that he again passed through Mosul on the way to Constantinople. And he found a guy called Mbota, since his first visit had been named French consul in, was it Turkey? A Frenchman by the looks of it. And this guy had commenced excavations on the opposite side of the river in the large mound called Koyunjik. These excavations were on a very small scale, and at the time of his passage, his journey there, only fragments of brick and alabaster upon which were engraved a few letters in the cuneiform character had been discovered. And then he seems to go into correspondence with a man in England. And he went to the Turkish capital, to the provinces, and so forth. And he talks about Mbota again. On receiving information of a discovery, went at once to the village, which was called Khosabad. This word is probably an abbreviation of Khosrow Abad, the abode of Khosroes, from their vicinity to the Kurdish mountains. Many of the villages in this part of Assyria had Persian names. He directed a wider trench to be formed and to be carried in the direction of the wall, of a wall that they discovered. He soon found that he had entered a chamber connected with others and surrounded by slabs of gypsum covered with sculptured representations of battles, sieges and similar events. His wonder might have easily been imagined. A new history had been suddenly opened to him. The records of an unknown people were before him. He was equally at a loss to account for the age and the nature of the monument. The art shown in the sculptures, the dresses of the figures, the mythic forms on the walls were all new to him, and afforded no clue to the epoch of the erection of the edifice and to the people who were its founders. Numerous inscriptions accompanying the bas-reliefs evidently contained explanation of the events thus recorded in sculpture. They were in the cuneiform or arrowhead character. The nature of these inscriptions was at least evidence that the building belonged to a period preceding the conquest of Alexander. That would be Alexander the Great. For it was generally admitted that after the subjugation of the west of Asia by the Macedonians, the cuneiform writing ceased to be employed. They didn't use it anymore. But too little was then known of this character to enable Mbota to draw any inference from the peculiar arrangement of the wedges, which distinguishes the varieties used in different countries. However, it was evident that the monument pertained to a very ancient and very civilized people, and it was natural from its position to refer it to the inhabitants of Nineveh, a city which, although it could not have occupied a site so distant from the Tigris, must have been in the vicinity of the place. Because people to survive have to have a river not far from them, right? They need that water. They always resided by a water, or river, rather. Imbota had discovered an Assyrian edifice, the first probably which had been exposed to the view of man since the fall of the Assyrian Empire. Imbota was not long in perceiving that the building, which had been thus partly excavated, unfortunately owed its destruction to fire, and that the gypsum slabs, reduced to lime, were rapidly falling to pieces on exposure to the air. No precaution could arrest this rapid decay, and it was to be feared that this wonderful monument had only been uncovered to complete its ruin. The records of victories and triumphs which had long tested the power and swelled the pride of the Assyrian kings, and had resisted the ravages of ages, were now passing away forever. They could scarcely be held together until an inexperienced pencil could secure an imperfect evidence of their former existence. Almost all that was first discovered thus speedily disappeared, and the same fate has befallen nearly everything subsequently found at Khorsabad. A regret was almost felt that so precious a memorial of a great nation should have been thus exposed to destruction, when no precaution could keep entire or secure the greater part of it. But as far as the object of the monument was concerned, the intention of its founder would be amply fulfilled, and the records of their might would be more widely spread and more effectively preserved by modern art than the most exalted ambition could have contemplated. Imbota lost no time in communicating his remarkable discovery to the principal scientific body in France. Knowing the interest that Layard felt in his labours, he allowed him to see his letters and drawings as they passed through Constantinople, and he was amongst the first who were made acquainted with his success of Imbota. And here he gladly availed himself of the opportunity of mentioning, with the acknowledgement and praise they deserve, his disinterestedness and liberality, so honourable to one engaged in the pursuit of knowledge. During the entire period of his excavations, Imbota regularly sent Layard not only his descriptions, shown hereafter, and what evidence we may still connect the edifice as uncovered at Khorsabad with the second dynasty of Assyrian kings, or with those monarchs, Esarhaddon or Sennacherib, who extended his conquest over the greater part of Asia. The success of Imbota had increased his anxiety to explore the ruins of Assyria. It was evident that Khorsabad could not stand alone. It did not represent ancient Nineveh, nor did it afford us or them any additional evidence as to the site of that city. If the edifice discovered had been one of its palaces, surely other buildings of a vaster and more magnificent character might exist, or must exist, nearer the seat of government on the banks of the River Tigris. It was true that Imbota had laboured unsuccessfully for about 3 months in the great mound opposite Mosul, which was usually identified with the Assyrian capital, but that mound much exceeded in extent any other known ruin, and it was possible that in some parts of it the traces of the buildings which it once contained were as completely lost as they were in many parts of the mound of or that would probably be, if there's a K and an H, that could possibly be Khorsabad, because in the Bible they say it's Kham, which is not Cam, it's Ham. The K is silent, and same as in the Egyptian. They have the same word, with the descendants of the sons of Noah, right? So yeah, that K might be silent. Layard's thoughts went back to Nimrud and the traditions which were attached to it. He spoke to others but received little encouragement. At last, in the autumn of 1845, Sir Stratford Canning mentioned to him his readiness to incur, for a limited period, the expense of excavations. So this guy was going to pay for it probably. in Assyria, and hoped that, should success attend the attempt, means would be found to carry it out on an adequate scale. So this guy is probably giving them funding to do that. He received with joy, Layard received with joy the offer of commencing and carrying on these excavations. The means were now within at his disposal to prosecute a work which he had so long desired to undertake. The reader will not, he trusts, be inclined to join with him in feelings of gratitude towards one who, whilst he had maintained so successfully the honour and interest of England by his high character and eminent abilities, acquired for his country so many great monuments of ancient civilization and art. And it has a footnote. And he need scarcely remind the reader that it is to Sir S. Canning we owe the marbles of Halicarnassus, now in the British Museum. The difficulties which stood in the way of the acquisition of those invaluable relics and the skill which was required to obtain them are not generally known. But he could testify, Layard, to the efforts and labour which were necessary for nearly 3 years before the repugnance of the Ottoman government, it's the Turkish Empire, right, could be overcome and permission obtained to extract the sculptures from the edifice, from the walls of a castle which was more jealously guarded than any similar edifice in the empire. Their removal, notwithstanding the almost insurmountable difficulties raised by the authorities and inhabitants of Bodrum, was more successfully effected by Mr. Ellison. The Elgin marbles and all other remains from Turkey or Greece now in Europe were obtained with comparative ease. It is to Sir Stratford Canning we are mainly indebted, or he said mainly indebted, for the collection of Assyrian antiquities with which the British Museum would be enriched. Without his liberality and public spirit, the treasures of Nimrud would have been reserved for the enterprise of those who have appreciated the value and importance of the discoveries at Khor Sabbath. The enlightened and liberal spirit shown by M. Botta is unfortunately not generally shared. It was consequently deemed most prudent and most conducive to the success of the undertaking that Layard should leave Constantinople without acquainting anyone with the object of his journey. He was only furnished with the usual documents given to travellers when recommended by the embassy, and with strong letters of introduction to the authorities at Mosul and in the neighbourhood. His preparations were soon completed, and he started from Constantinople by steamer to Samsun in the middle of October. He needs scarcely trouble the reader with the details of his progress through a country so well known and so often written about as that between Samsun and Mosul. Anxious to reach the end of his journey, he crossed the mountains of Pontus and the great steppes of the Austen Henry Layard as fast as post horses could carry him, descended the highlands into the valley of the Tigris, galloped over the vast plains of Assyria, and reached Mosul in 12 days. Again, chapter 2 is about him reaching Mosul. About this guy that was a soldier of type and had a rank in the once irregular cavalry. It goes on about the Pasha and some sort of battle that they had, some problems they had. Okay, going to go back one page. It talks about Abraham. About a palace that was built by, it looks like Athur. Yes, Athur, Athur, the Kia or lieutenant of Nimrud. Here the holy Abraham, peace be with him, cast down and break in pieces the idols which were worshipped by the unbelievers. The impious Nimrud, enraged at the destruction of his gods, sought to slay Abraham and wage war against him. But the prophet prayed to God and said, "Deliver me, O God, from this man who worships stones and boasts himself to be the Lord of all beings." And God said to him, "How shall I punish him?" And the prophet answered, "To thee armies are as nothing, and the strength and power of men are likewise. Before the smallest of thy creatures will they perish." And God was pleased at the faith of the prophet, and he sent a gnat. It's like a little insect, right? A little flying insect. Sort of, probably like, like a vinegar fly or something like that. The annoying little thing. Which vexed Nimrod night and day, so that he built himself a room of glass in yonder palace, that he might dwell therein and shut out the insect. But the gnat entered also and passed by his ear into his brain, upon which it fed and increased in size day by day, so that the servants of Nimrod beat his head with a hammer continually, that he might have some ease from his pain. But he died after suffering these torments for 400 years. That's probably a myth, right? That he lived that long, maybe. Because usually you find, like in the original ancient Tab Ashrit, Aramaic, Brita or Genesis in English, that they, in the Americanized Bible, English Bible version, it says Adam lived to be 930, but it's actually talking about his lineage. They use some logic and common sense. In reality, as Genesis says, he'll be living by the sword, like all these struggles and stuff like that, even facing death, so they'll be up against disease and all that sort of stuff. So pretty doubtful that they'd live up 930 years. Such other tales to this day repeated. Okay, this says here, this and similar traditions are found in a work called Kuset el Nimrud, Stories of Nimrod, which represents the inhabitants of the villages near the ruins as reading during the winter nights. Although there is no one in these days within some miles of the place who possesses the work or could read if he did, the tales it contains are current amongst the Arabs of the neighbourhood. Layard heard of several manuscripts of the Kuset at Mosul, but as they are classed amongst religious volumes, he was unable to procure a copy. See note in chapter 21 of Salil's Quran for a story somewhere similar to that in the text. Okay, so such are the tales to this day, or to his day, that moment he was in, repeated by the Arabs who wander around the remains of a great city, which by the tradition they unwittingly help to identify. Awad volunteered to walk in the middle of the night to Salamiya, a village 3 miles distant, and to some Arab tents in the neighbourhood to procure men to assist in the excavations. There was some worker with him, right? He slept a little during the night and so forth. Okay, and he talks on about this Awad guy and etc. And then they finally come upon some sort of mound by the looks of it. Okay, somebody brought him a handful of rubbish, amongst which he found with joy the fragment of a bas-relief. The material on which it was carved had been exposed to fire and resembled in every respect the burnt gypsum of Khorsabad. Convinced from this discovery that sculptured remains must still exist in some part of the mound, he sought for a place where excavations might be commenced with a prospect of success. Awad led him to a piece of alabaster which appeared above the soil. He could not remove it, and on digging downward it proved to be the upper part of a large slab. He ordered all the men to work around it, and they shortly uncovered a second slab to which it had been united. Continuing in the same line, they came upon a third, and in the course of the morning laid bare 10 more, the whole forming a square with one stone missing at the northwest corner. It was evident that the top of a chamber had been discovered and that the gap was its entrance. And footnote down the bottom. This was the chamber marked A on Plan 3. He then dug down the face of the stones, and an inscription in the cuneiform character was soon exposed to view. Similar inscriptions occupied the centre of all the slabs, which were in the best preservation, but plain, with the exception of the writing. Leaving half the workmen to uncover as much of the chamber as possible, he led the rest to the southwest corner of the mound, where he had observed many fragments of calcined alabaster. He dug at once into the side of the mound, which was there very steep, and thus avoided the necessity of removing much earth. They came almost immediately to a wall, and it says down the bottom, back of wall. Plan 2. Bearing inscriptions in the same character as those already described, but the slabs had evidently been exposed to intense heat, were cracked in every part, and reduced to lime, threatened to fall to pieces as soon as uncovered. Night interrupted their labours. He returned to the village well satisfied with their results. It was now evident that buildings of considerable extent existed in the mound, and that although some had been destroyed by fire, others had escaped the conflagration. As there were inscriptions and as the fragments of a bas-relief had been found, it was natural to conclude that sculptures were still buried under the soil. He determined to follow the search at the northwest corner and to empty the chamber partly uncovered during the day. On returning to the village, he removed from the crowded hovel in which they had passed the night. With the assistance of Awad, who was no less pleased than himself with their success, they patched up with mud the least ruined house in the village and restored its falling roof. They contrived at least to exclude in some measure the cold night winds and to obtain a little privacy for his companion and himself. Next morning his workmen were increased by 5 Turkomans from Salamiya, who had been attracted by the prospect of regular wages. He employed half of them in emptying the chamber partly uncovered on the previous day, and the rest in following the wall at the southwest corner of the mount. Before evening the work of the first party was completed, and he found himself in a room built of slabs about 8 feet high and varying from 6 to 4 feet in breadth, or length or something like that, placed upright and closely fitted together. One of the slabs had fallen backwards from its place and was supported in a slanting position by the soil behind. Upon it was rudely inscribed in Arabic characters the name Ahmed Pasha, one of the former hereditary governors of Mosul. A native of Salamiya remembered that some Christians were employed to dig into the mound about 30 years before in search of stone for the repair of the tomb of Sultan Abd Allah, a Muslim saint buried on the left bank of the Tigris, a few miles below its junction with the Zab. They uncovered the slab, but being unable to move it, they cut upon it the name of the employee, the Pasha. His informant further stated that in another part of the mound he had forgotten the precise spot they had found sculptured figures, which they broke in pieces, the fragments being used in the reparation of the tomb. The bottom of the chamber was paved with smaller slabs than those employed in the construction of the walls. They were covered with inscriptions on both sides, and on removing one of them, Layard found that it had been placed upon a layer of bitumen, which must have been in a liquid state, for it had retained with remarkable distinctness and accuracy an impression of the characters carved upon the stone. The inscriptions on the face of the upright slabs were about 20 lines in length, and all were precisely similar. In one corner, as it had been observed, a slab was wanting, and although no remains of building could be traced, it was evident from the continuation of the pavement beyond the walls of the chamber that this was the entrance. As the soil had been worn away by the rains to within a few inches of the tops of the upright slabs, he could form no conjecture as to the original height of the room or as to the nature of the walls above the casing of alabaster. In the rubbish near the bottom of the chamber he found several ivory ornaments, upon which were traces of gilding. Amongst them was the figure of a man in long robes, carrying in one hand the Egyptian crux ansata. Maybe that's that eternal life symbol, right? Part of a crouching sphinx, and flowers designed with great taste and elegance. Awad, who had his own suspicions of the object of his search, which he could scarcely persuade himself was limited to mere stones, carefully collected all the scattered fragments of gold leaf he could find in the rubbish, and calling him aside in a mysterious and confidential fashion, produced them wrapped up in a piece of dingy paper. "Oh, Bey," said he, "Wallah, your books are right, and the Franks know that which is hid from the true believer. Here is the gold, sure enough, and please God, we shall find it all in a few days. Only don't say anything about it to those Arabs, for they are asses," according to this guy, "and cannot hold their tongues. The matter will come to the ears of the Pasha." The Sheikh was much surprised and equally disappointed when Layard generously presented him with the treasures he had collected and all such as he might hereafter discover. He left him muttering "Ya Rubi" and other pious ejaculations, and lost in conjectures as to the meaning of these strange proceedings. He's probably cursing or that sister. On reaching the foot of the slabs in the southwest corner, they found a great accumulation of charcoal, which is further evidence of the cause of the destruction of one of the buildings discovered. Layard dug also in several directions in this part of the mound, and in many places came upon walls branching out at different angles. And he goes on about that. And then an Arab of the tribe of Haddadin informed him that figures had been accidentally uncovered in the mound near the village of Talkif. He offered to take him to the place. They rode out together, but he only pointed out the site of an old quarry with a few rudely hewn stones. Such disappointments were daily occurring, and Layard wearied himself with scouring the country to see remains which had been most minutely described to him as groups of sculptures and slabs covered with writing, and which generally proved to be the ruin of some modern building or an early tombstone inscribed with Arabic characters. Okay, he goes on about the Yezidis, the devil worshippers, or some sort of satanic type worshippers, etc. And he's like a drawing of probably what he found, that area, the chamber, whatever, that hallway, and then all the different things that he found in them, in that different places. Trying to find if we found in like Assyrian inscriptions and translated them, etc., or cuneiform tablets. We've jumped to chapter 8, where it has titles or subjects: Introduction of Christianity into Assyria, origin of the Chaldean or Nestorian Church, early missions of the Chaldeans, and so forth. And it reads, the account given in the preceding chapter of the Chaldean or Nestorian tribes will probably make the reader desirous of knowing something of their condition and of the events which led to the isolation of a small Christian community in the midst of the mountains of Kurdistan. Indeed, the origin of the race, as well as the important position which the Chaldean Church once held in Asia, renders the subject one of considerable historical interest. To Protestants, the doctrines and rites of a primitive sect of Christians who have ever remained untainted by the superstitions of Rome must be of high importance, and it is a matter of astonishment that more curiosity has not been excited by them and more sympathy felt for their sufferings. In the first centuries of the Christian era, the plains of Assyria proper were still the battleground of the nations of the east and the west. From the fall of the Assyrian Empire, whose capital was Nineveh, the rich districts watered by the Tigris and Euphrates had been continually exposed to foreign invasion. Their cities had been levelled with the ground, the canals which gave fertility to the soil had been destroyed, and a great part of the ancient population had either been exterminated or carried away captive to distant regions. Still, there lingered in the villages and around the sites of the ruined cities the descendants of those who had formerly possessed the land. They had escaped the devastating sword of the Persians, of the Greeks, and of the Romans. They still spoke the language of their ancestors and still retained the name of their race. The doctrines of Christianity had early penetrated into the Assyrian provinces. They may even have been carried there by those who had imbibed them at their source. When, in the first part of the 5th century, the church was agitated by the dissensions of Saint Cyril and Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Chaldeans were already recognized as one of the most extensive of the Eastern sects. Nestorius himself was never in Assyria, but it will be remembered that in the struggle at Ephesus between him and his rival Saint Cyril, his chief supporters were the Eastern bishops, who accompanied John of Antioch to the Third Ecumenical Council, AD 431. Although the peculiar doctrines held by Nestorius had been previously promulgated on the borders of Assyria by Diodorus of Tarsus and Theodorus the Bishop of Mopsuestia, and had been recognized by the celebrated school of Edessa, the Ur of the Chaldeans or Chaldees, and the last seat of their learning, yet until the persecution of the Patriarch of Constantinople, that had been Nestorius, the schism had not attracted much attention. It was to the rank and sufferings of Nestorius that the doctrines which he had maintained owed their notoriety in those who professed them their name. These doctrines were alternately taught and condemned in the school of Edessa, that would be Urhai, right, to the time of its close by an order of the Emperor Zeno. Those who professed them were known as the Persian party. When the Emperor called upon all Christian sects to forget their dissensions and to subscribe the Henoticon, or Articles of Faith, Barsumas, the recusant Bishop of Nisibis, placed himself under the protection of the Persian king Firuz. Cassius, who on the murder of Babuasis was elected to the Archbishopric of Seleucia, or Ctesiphon. The names of Seleucia and Ctesiphon are very frequently confounded by the early Christian writers, but the cities stood on opposite sides of the River Tigris and were built at different periods. They secretly possessed the Nestorian doctrines. Barbaeus, his successor, openly declared himself in favour of the new sect, and from his accession may be dated the first recognised establishment of the Nestorian Church in the East, where they were actually wrongly called the Nestorian Church, because he never founded it, because they agreed with his hypostasis statement that he had in front of Virgil, and he ended up calling him a heretic and all this sort of stuff, saying that Christ was both divine and man. He had the two natures, he was of two substances. So yeah, that's another reason why they got persecuted throughout the centuries. Small part, but part of the persecution, right? By the Roman Catholic Church, etc. Okay, so the promulgation of its doctrines amongst the nation of Central Asia. Until the fall of the Sassanian dynasty and the establishment of the Arab supremacy in the provinces to the east of the Tigris, the Chaldeans were alternately protected and persecuted. Their condition mainly depending upon the relative strength of the Persian and Byzantine empires. Still, their tenets were recognized as those of the Eastern Church, and their chief, at an early period, received the title of Patriarch of the East. Today they're called Patriarchates. They laboured assiduously to disseminate their doctrines over the continent of Asia, and it is even asserted that one of the Persian kings was amongst their converts. From Persia, where the Chaldean bishoprics were early established, they spread eastwards, and Cosmas Indicopleustes, who visited Asia in the early part of the 6th century, declares that they had bishops, martyrs and priests in India, Arabia, Felix and Socotra. Amongst the Bactrians, the Huns, the Persarmenians, the Medes and the Elamites, or Elamites, and that their metropolitans even penetrated into China as early as 5th century. Cosmos Indicopleustes in Topographic Christian Assimony, Volume 4, page 92, and so forth. They obviously spoke about that, wrote about that, right? The celebrated inscription of Siganfu, which was seen by the Jesuit missionaries in the year 1625, gives more particulars regarding the state of the Chaldean church in China from AD 620 to 781. The Chaldeans had enjoyed during that period, with only 2 exceptions, the imperial favour, and their doctrines had been preached before the court and throughout the empire. This inscription, the authenticity of which, so long contested, seems at length to be generally admitted, contains an exposition of the creed of the sect and of their peculiar tenets, and ceremonies a short history of the progress of Christianity in China and the names of the missionaries who preached the gospel in that country. The date of the erection of the monument is given in these words. This is this black stele, right, with Chinese writing on it and Aramaic underneath, apparently. In the empire of the family of the Great Tang, in the 2nd year of the reign of King Kung, on Sunday, the 7th day of the month of autumn, was erected the stone. The bishop, Hung Kui, administering to the Church of China, a Mandarin whose name was Liu Si Qian, and his title was Kiao Yi Kun, whose predecessor was, and goes on like that, wrote this inscription with his own hand. In the margin is written in Syriac, in the days of the father of fathers, Ma and Jesus, the patriarch. Below are these words also in Syriac. In the Greek year 1092, Ma Yezidis, a presbyter and chorepiscopus of the royal city of Chumdan, the son of Melisius of happy memory, a presbyter of Balhe in Kurdistan, erected this tablet of stone, in which are described the precepts of our Saviour and the preaching of our fathers to the Emperor of the Chinese. These notices fix the date of the monument to AD 781. The patriarch and Yezidis died about 778, but it is highly probable that the intelligence of his death had not yet reached the far distant regions of China, as a footnote indicator. So underneath it says, for a full account of this remarkable monument, which is so peculiarly interesting as affording irrefragable proof of the spread of Christianity in Asia during the early centuries of the Christian era, the reader is referred to Asimani, who published a transcript of the inscription. De Herbelot had also given a description and analysis of the inscription in the supplement to his Bibliothèque Orientale, and its genuineness has been canvassed by numerous controversial writers. Mr. Millman, in an able note in his edition of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, chapter 57 or 67, it might be 47, I think it's 57, has pointed out upon what evidence its authenticity can be established. It was discovered in the foundations of the walls of the city of Blishit. No, that's wrong. It has pointed out what evidence its authenticity can be established. It was discovered in the foundations of the walls of the city of Seganfu. Above the Chinese inscription is the figure of a cross. The title then follows, written in 3 characters. The inscription itself contains 62 lines, counting the lines from right to left, or 28 if read from top to bottom, after the manner of the Chinese. It begins by stating that it was written by King Sing, a priest of the kingdom of Taitain. That which follows may be divided into 21 sections, containing a profession of Christian faith, as an exposition of church ceremonies and observances in accordance with Nestorian doctrines, and a general history of the introduction and progress of Christianity in the empire. The inscription is followed by 7 lists of missionaries who preached the gospel in China from the year 636, written in the ancient Syriac, a Strangler character. The names are Syriac, Persian or Pahlavi, and Chinese. The 5th section contains an account of the arrival in China of Olapuin, or Yabala, a preacher of the gospel of Christ from Tasin, when Tai Kung, the second emperor of the 13th dynasty, called Dang, was upon the throne. That monarch, by an edict or a decree or a law published in the 12th year of his reign, approved of the Christian religion and commanded the mandarins to build a church, upon the walls of which the portrait of the emperor was painted as an ornament. The tradition of his connection with Sergius, a Nestorian monk, is well known. Okay, that's another footnote. Find in the earliest annals of the Chaldean Church frequent accounts of missionaries sent by the patriarchs of the East into Tartary and China, and notices of their success and of their fate. When the Arabs invaded the territories of the Persian kings and spread their new faith, Mohammedanism, over Asia, they found the Chaldean Church already powerful in the East. Even in Arabia, its missionaries had gained extensive influence, and Muhammad himself may have owed the traditions and learning which he embodied in the Quran to the instruction of a Chaldean monk. The tradition of his connection with Sergius, a Nestorian monk, is well known, so that's maybe what he was influenced by. It's saying there. He may have incorporated the traditions and learning which he embodied. He put it into the Quran to the instruction, because of the instruction of a Chaldean monk that he came across. At any rate, the Arabian prophet appears to have. So that proves that Muhammad was actually a real guy. He existed, being well disposed towards the Nestorians. For one of his first acts after he had established his power was to enter into a treaty with them. By this document, not only protection but various privileges were secured to the sect. They were freed from military service, their customs and laws were to be respected, the clergy were to be exempted from the payment of tribute, the taxes imposed on the rich were limited to 12 pieces of money, those to be paid by the poor to 4, and it was expressly declared that when a Christian woman entered into the service of a Muslim, she should not be compelled to change her religion, to abstain from her fasts, or to neglect her customary prayers and the ceremonies enjoined by her church. Footnote indicator. The substance of this treaty is given by 3 Syriac authors: Bar Hebraeus, it looks like Maris, have to check it out, that one. Yeah, Maris, M-A-R-I-S, and Amrus, Assamani, Volume 4, page 59. It was first published in Arabic and Latin by Gabriel Sionita, Paris 1630, and is usually called the Testamentum Mahometic. While its authenticity is admitted by early Mohammedan and Eastern Christian writers, this treaty is rejected as a forgery by most European critics. It is not, however, improbable that it is founded upon some traditionary compact.